What's good, you guys? So, we are, of course, in a little bit of a downtime on the tennis calendar between Aussie Open and the Sunshine Double before heading into clay court season, where, you got your indoor events, you got your events out in the Middle East, as well as the Golden Swing on the horizon, if not, smack in the middle of some of these indoor events. But, of course, since I didn't really talk about the Australian Open much, outside of the final, I did want to share with you guys some of my takeaways from that tournament and things that I'm going to be looking out for during, this February-March stretch heading into clay court season. And of course, on that note, I would just like to, get a little heart-to-heart in that I am well aware of how inconsistent my uploading has been, really over the years outside of the summer. Seems like, I've become somewhat of a channel slam merchant myself. Before now, there was school as an excuse, and even then, I definitely still could have been more regular. But that is something I would really like to change. And especially when I had planned all year with a lot of ideas that I thought really had some merit behind them, to really focus on them during winter, during our tennis off season, historical stuff that I enjoyed doing the most that, I wouldn't have to pay as much credence at that point to current happenings on tour, and, I barely acted on them. I got one video out, the Andy Murray retirement tribute, and then, ended up sitting on those ideas for no reason other than laziness, I guess. And that's frustrating, I would be frustrated if I was a subscriber of myself. And yeah, I'm aware that you get out of this what you put in, so yeah, here's to doing better on that front in big 2025. I would, of course, like to, thank you guys, the viewers, so much for still being so patient in spite of just my upload frequency, and I would like to start doing something a little bit more interactive. We obviously have a little bit of a gang here, and, I do my best to reply to a lot of the comments, but I have been thinking for a while, maybe starting a hot take segment where you guys can send in, your hot takes about tennis, have me reply to them, react to them. This way also, there's less of a stopgap when I don't have as many ideas. All the while just getting to, let our hair down, go off script a little bit, and, just broaden, a sense of community here. When I start doing something like that, you can hit me up here. I'll probably post on the YouTube community tab, but also on my Twitter. If you're more active over there, it is definitely my most used social media of the bunch, as a not very active on social media in general person. But yeah, you can find me there at AK10s123, AK10s the same way you see it here on YouTube. That'll also be linked in the description below. But with that out of the way, let's get to this video. And already I'm recording this at the beginning of the week as Rotterdam has just started. We have seen our top two seeds play their first matches already, both equally ugly in Carlos Alcaraz, Daniil Medvedev's wins, which segues me into my first point, and that is Carlos Alcaraz and some of the hard court and mental struggles of late. The former of which, I have discussed a lot since looking at his year holistically in 2024, and in general, really, since playing that classic Cincinnati final in 2023. Carlos has been super patchy on the hard courts, and we've kind of gotten a feel for his preferences to this point through his first 3 years as a top player, 2022 to the present, and that is, he has always been exceptional at the Sunshine Double, and in particular, you could argue that Indian Wells is his best event in general, because I don't think he looks as clinical anywhere else as he has Indian Wells. But of course, Indian Wells is a bit of an outlier in the conditions. It's always been one of the grittiest, slowest hard courts, and there's really nothing quite like it in the sport. Especially now as, the US Open late 2010s got super, super slow. It's been sped back up in the 2020s. Australia been slicker since like 2016, 17-ish. And while he's a guy that his base level is going to beat a lot of these litmus test guys, and he's still going to make it to quarters, even semis, instead of, the expectations normally for him to be semis and beyond at every event he plays. The last year, Beijing, Indian Wells, those are his standout results, but he's taken a lot of bad losses in there. Even in the losses to good players, he didn't perform well in Australia last year in the loss to Zverev at all. I thought in a really big marquee match, this quarterfinal loss to Novak Djokovic was probably the closest we've come to a dud Alcaraz performance in a big match. The roller coaster nature of his game in all these big finals, really aside from Wimbledon in the final last year where start to finish he was really good, he does tend to be very up and down. But to me, in his loss to Novak, the down period lasted way longer than we're typically used to, and it wasn't in the way that we've seen in the past where he just became an error machine. I mean, he was making a good amount of unforced errors, but relative to how he's been playing of late, nothing so alarming that, he just coughed up the match to Novak on a silver platter. But that does lead me into the mental part of things, where some of the early skepticisms, particularly with his reliance on Ferrero, are sort of beginning to gather validity. And I don't even want to lay it at the feet of, reliance on coaching, because it didn't seem like, having access to the coaching this Australian Open really did all that much for him, because he just didn't adjust. And for a guy that, was so good so early, and one of his trademarks was learning so quickly. We saw it from, 2022. He looked raw on grass, and even his first match of 23, and then he mastered it, in short order. The occasion overtook him in that semifinal at Roland Garros in 2023, and it only took a couple weeks after and the slam right after for him to beat Novak Djokovic, the overwhelming best player in the world at that point, in a final, in a 5-set final at that, to answer, all the mental and physical questions after cramping 2 sets through their Roland Garros semi. So that being said, it is so weird to see him struggle with on-the-fly adjustments mid-match, because, he seemed like he couldn't read the Djokovic serve at the Olympics in Paris, and now on a slicker surface, the slice serve just continued to burn him time and time again. And at least there, it being clay and him having such tremendous speed to still get his teeth into some of those points where he was dragged so far off court, there was that to bank on. Much less so here. He was robbed of time even more by the surface. And then, with the progression of the match, as, many people noted ad nauseum, there was a lack of killer instinct in not burying Djokovic when he seemed to have him dead to rights at the end of set 1. And you saw a little bit of that at Cincinnati 23, but the thing is, at Cincinnati 23, I thought he played one really, really loose game while he was up a break in the second set. But other than that, I can't really point to anything. He battled amazingly well the rest of the match. He blinked one time, and Djokovic just got an inch, he took it a mile. Here, it seemed like he eased the foot off the gas and sort of was playing with his foot a little bit, because there really was no clarity through the middle portion of the match on his end. Much of the second set, it seemed like he was just testing how much Djokovic could push off on his leg, looping a lot of balls up high, seeing how Novak would respond to that. And, Djokovic, as the approach for him became more clear that he was just going to have to go hyper-aggressive, and he got into this ball-striking zone, those tactics just seemed to, set him up for target practice and get him into that zone. And whether it was tactically, emotionally, it just seemed like Alcaraz didn't know what to do. As visible a mental fog for as prolonged a period in a match as I've seen from somebody of his caliber in a really, really long time. And again, he's learned it before. This is the ultimate, give him an inch, he'll take it a mile player to do that against. And if you black out for the better part of 2 sets, I don't care who you are. That's just going to be tough to come back from. Now, I do feel like there's a little bit too much of the sky is falling from certain sects around the discourse on Alcaraz after that loss. Because, at the end of the day, Djokovic still held off the best foot forward of Alcaraz for the last 8 or so games of that match. If he had slipped up or let up a little bit, Alcaraz had woken up enough to very easily make his way back into the match, and that passage of play was actually, the vintage Djokovic-Alcaraz exchanges that we have gotten used to whenever these two play. And the fact that Djokovic was able to survive that, I think on its own showed it was a well-playing Novak on Rod Laver Arena. And yeah, given his track record there, it's not the worst loss in the world, far from it. And with that being the case, regardless, there's plenty of evidence to suggest that no matter what Carlos would have done, Djokovic would have come out victorious here. I wouldn't say on Novak's end that it was, a top shelf performance. There's no shortage of GOATY Djokovic performances at the Australian Open. And, despite it being another notch in his belt, another landmark win, which it's always going to be whenever he comes out on top against this guy that's 15 years his junior and a generational player, I believe. But forget, his all-time Australian Open performances where there's no shortage. I would say there's still a gear to go even for old Novak at this stage where, just on the quality of the tennis he put forth, I would still have it a notch down from, like Turin 23 or the Olympics last year. And that is why, I can hear some of the concerns on the other side of this loss for the Alcaraz side. But the main thing here, I think, is just the recent evidence he's put forth on hard courts. And I'm talking just this year. I mean, I thought he started this Australian Open really, really well, but, from that awful third set against Nuno Borges where he hit like 20 unforced errors, not a great first set against Draper either, before obviously the mileage jack had tacked on all tournament kicked in. And then of course, I've gone on at length about how I'd assess his quarterfinal performance, but also, today, a match where both him and Bodek, the level was sort of appalling. I mean, 48 unforced errors, 40 for Carlos and Bodek respectively over 3 sets. I am starting to wonder, if US Open 2022, a tournament that obviously had, I would say, one of, if not the match of the decade so far between Alcaraz and Sinner, but also a tournament with so much wonky stuff going on, and one that became so wide open. I am wondering, if that maybe gave us a little bit of a misrepresentation early on of how good Alcaraz was on hard courts. Because, while on paper, there is no reason he shouldn't be very good on pretty much any court he steps on. That just hasn't manifested itself on a consistent basis. But I'm not truly going to be concerned for him unless this sort of play carries over into what's been his most successful time of year, starting Indian Wells through Wimbledon, where, given the last 2 years where he came into that stretch injured and was injured last year throughout it, I have no reason to believe that he won't right the ship then, but we will wait and see. But as of the now of things, I think you just want to see improvement in Alcaraz's game relative to where it's been since post the Olympics. Asia aside, a lot to be desired, and perhaps he just needs a little more time to get acclimated to a lot of the tweaks, the serve, the backhand that he said he made in the offseason, as well as adding some weight to the racket. Maybe that's contributed to how errant his play has been of late. So yeah, I think over the next month, win or lose, It is good that he's testing himself on the surface, I think, as opposed to Golden Swing. So yeah, I mean, while he's at it, again, win or lose the tournament, I would just like to see him look more comfortable with his game and improve. Sheesh, I did not expect, a takeaway to take that long. My apologies, but of course, I didn't talk about that match on its own, so got my 2 cents about it out all at once. Moving on, let's talk about the other part of that match, Novak Djokovic, and as a whole, you have to say his year has gotten out on the right foot, simply off his Australian Open performance. So far, so good with the collaboration with Andy Murray, and I did think, you got to see some of the influence there, just on the court. I thought I saw more slicing that I'm accustomed to out of Djokovic, and Andy Murray special. And yeah, for as animated as Murray was on court, in the box, he really seemed like a calming figure, at least to my eye. But, I think everybody's question has to be, how Novak bounces back from this injury. As we've heard of late, it wasn't as bad as in 2023, and he could be back as soon as Doha. But, at that age, obviously, any injury, you do have to wonder. It's not always a given that, they're going to be back in short order. But in addition to that, in a stretch that Novak has looked so, haphazard at, for a lack of a better word, for, the better part of the last decade in post-Australian Open, really through Monte Carlo or so. I don't know how worth his time it is to, not just hold out until we hit clay. That's kind of what he's done. Obviously not by choice over the last couple of years. I also do understand that, at his age, it might also be worth just getting more matches in if you can to avoid a situation where you come back rusty, but there is plenty of time to shake off the rust, as we found during clay court season with Novak himself. He tends to become a different player, by Rome, and that's why, coming off a very productive Australian Open, knowing you still have that form in you, knowing that, he looks rejuvenated, fired up again, I might just hold out until the clay court season if I'm Djokovic. I mean, look at his record on the dirt, the big clay events since 2021, particularly Roland Garros. He's been exceptional. It's a big prize where you're probably going to have a shot, I believe so much so that I picked him to win that title, coming into this year. And yeah, with him getting injured now more often as he's gotten older, I would eye the big one, the next big one. I don't know how worth it is for Novak to play at all in February, March. So I am interested to see when we next see him. Could be in a couple weeks, could be in a couple months. Another one that you sit tight and say, let's wait and watch. But on somebody more current who, now has crashed out of Rotterdam as well, Daniil Medvedev is now 15-13, his overall record since Wimbledon last year. And that's really the last good, impressive result Medvedev had was, getting his lick back at Sinner. Wimbledon quarterfinal, then hung in there, played a decent match against Alcaraz in the semi as well. And even if we want to exclude the Laver Cup matches, which, I have had a beef with them just retroactively counting those matches like 2 years after the tournament started. But even so, 15-11, not exactly sparkling either. He was in a dogfight for 2 sets with damn near 40-year-old Stan Wawrinka. And now, of course, he loses to Mattia Bellucci, who, I only saw prior against Ben Shelton at Wimbledon last year. But, I had Medvedev preseason as a guy that I saw falling from, the top 4 staple that he had been the last couple years, last 5 or so years, and dialing back to, a 5 through 8 type guy. But the results over the past 6+ months, he's honestly closer to where Tsitsipas is right now than that 5 to 8 fringe guy, because, these are just not becoming of a top 10 player. he has continued to look jaded, sort of, lacking some passion, fire to the eye. And beyond that, yeah, I mean, it just looks like pretty much any top player that doesn't have matchup problems with him or anybody with weapons right now is very much alive to beat Daniil Medvedev regardless of the court. 2 years ago, after, his prior bad slump since he became a top player after the 2022 Oz Open final, this was where Medvedev turned it around and went on a tear in the spring of 2023, right from Rotterdam, pretty much. And I was interested to see, maybe if this stretch that, he should have good feelings with in the past can revive him a little bit heading into Sunshine Double. At least regain some confidence, but it's not looking good right now. And that's fine, that's natural, I guess. On paper, you can come around to why that would be the case with Medvedev's shoulder problems over the last couple years. And that combined with his game sort of not, at least on paper, which I know a lot of people have bucked that trend and, especially the recent past, but, his game just not seeming conducive to great longevity. I don't know if I'm there yet, but, you gotta be concerned. It does seem to feel different this time. And speaking of which, Medvedev's fellow colleagues in that OG Next Gen cohort, in what will be a very important year for all of them by the looks of it, especially given how good, the class of 2024's Next Gen Finals have started this year. In addition to the double-headed monster at the top of this game right now, in a time where a lot of them, seem like they were trending downwards through 2024, their place among all of this really seemed up in the air, and the early returns, certainly not great in Australia, and that includes, Medvedev, we already touched on him, but Tsitsipas first round exit, Casper Ruud, not good in his first round, and promptly shown the exit door in the second round by Jakub Mensik. Rublev, of course, dismissed by Fonseca. And yeah, the early returns from this season certainly line up with what it looked like on paper, that a lot of these guys' spots, within the top 10, top 15, they were going to need to be on high alert to keep them. And really, sans Alexander Zverev, all of them were beaten by guys that were participating at the Next Gen Finals just a month or so before the Australian Open. And, in all of their cases, it seems to be a simultaneous case of them declining and all of those guys ascending. Something that I don't think any of those guys can afford. Out of them, I still, like Casper Ruud on clay to still be able to pull out some top-tier results. But as for the others, they haven't done much in a while. In Stefanos' case, the knife only, plunged deeper into the damage here, with Australia always seeming to be his most consistent slam, and him slipping up there, albeit in a bad matchup. It doesn't bode well, considering there are already so many other venues that he's not comfortable at all at. You wonder where the point's gonna come from if he's ceding ground like this, on some of his favorite venues. There's now back-to-back Australian Opens, not making the quarters there. Casper, he's pretty much had one good result off clay in the past, year, 52 weeks. It's just been Turin, where, surprisingly enough, he is now a proven performer there. He's made semis all 3 times he's played, at least. And, for him, I guess he's kind of playing with house money until clay court season, just because of, how few and far between the off-clay good results have been since 2022. But when you do that, again, that ranking's not going to stay at 5 for too long if, the consistency doesn't change. And then Andre, I think he deserves to be cut some slack. It was, a brutal first-round draw in Fonseca, even despite, playing so well through Next Gen Finals and then that Challenger in Canberra coming in. he still performed well above, his skis for what people were expecting from that match. I think everybody was like, that was the standout first round where you could see, Zhao taking it 5. But instead, that was a complete tour de force on what Fonseca can become. And truth be told, that is just a ceiling that, Rublev's not going to be capable of hanging with. And he was unfortunate to be on the receiving end of it, but now he loses to Kovacevic in Montpellier semis. And yeah, going back to even before Madrid last year, it's been rough sledding for him as well. No longer even, the lock to win these smaller events that he was, even 2-3 years ago. And those are just your top guys. I mean, elsewhere there was Tiafoe, Kachanov with some early exits, also at the hands of younger guys. Hurkacz looked good for, a couple of matches at the beginning of the year, and then his first match, and then seemed like he got hurt second round. But so far in 2025, that OG Next Gen class really struggling to make much of an imprint on this season, Zverev aside. And then, on the flip side, your 2024 Next Gen class, which I sort of touched upon, I thought these guys were the best part about week 1 of the Australian Open, which I thought was electric. As I outlined, a lot of these guys with big early scalps, Tien over Medvedev, in probably what I would consider the best match of the tournament. Obviously, for the mainstream, it's going to be Djokovic Alcaraz, but I thought that was a bigger moment than it was a great match. Tien Medvedev was, actually thrilling, start to finish. And yeah, I mean, Lerner really showed me something there with really just, I saw the vision of how he could have a very productive career. I still, want to see more to see where his ceiling is just off of not being the biggest guy and, by proxy having a little bit of a power deficiency. But, he really drove a lot of people crazy who played him this Australian Open. Even the OG backboarder himself, Daniil Medvedev, in a way that he used to drive people crazy. And even at the end there, the 5th set in particular, after Medvedev served for it late in the 5th, from that point on, I thought, Lerner actually did a great job, injecting a bit of pace himself, taking charge. And that's why I say he won that match more than Daniil lost it. And yeah, I mean, you can just see the outline of how he's going to win matches is, he's just going to make a lot of balls, and it's going to be really hard to hit through him. Elsewhere, as I said, Fonseca, gave us a flash of what it can look like when he puts it all together. And I don't know, that might just be a guy that, somewhere down the line, maybe in short order, is on the level with your Sinner and Alcaraz's. Obviously, long way to go. But he really does seem like, that level of prospect that can at least compete. And in particular, it's just, the sound that comes off this dude's racket when he hits the ball. It's something so distinct. It's like a Del Potro. It's just, that's what I liken it to. It's just a cannonball when he makes impact. And yeah, it was just a real clean showing. At the end of the day, lost in 5 to Sonego, ended up making the quarterfinals. But that's as good a slam debut showing as you'll see. Mickelson, of course, upsetting Tsitsipas and demolishing a Karen Khachanov, who ended last year so strong and had become a pretty strong, consistent performer in the slams the last couple of years. Impressive start to the year for him. And he actually, in less than a year, he looks a whole lot more explosive. I thought when I first saw Mickelson, summer 23 and even through the beginning of last year, that, he looked kind of clunky around the court. He looked like he didn't really have a way of overcoming the movement barrier. But, between seeing him against Novak in Shanghai at the end of last year and now to start this year, that aspect looks a whole lot better. He looks way more comfortable on the run. And as a strong guy, that's just going to boost his ceiling that much more. Jakub Mensik, another guy who's come out of the box super complete. tremendously clean ball striker in his own right, and probably would have made week 2 here, if not for a bit of a choke against Davidovich Fokina 2 sets up in the third round. But still, it's been an excellent last few months for him, and he is certainly on the up and up. Arthur Fils, wasn't particularly great all tournament long, even winning his 2 matches. But that being said, I feel that there is still a little bit more polish and rawness to iron out with Fils. In some ways similar to Felix, and, that he's just such a great athlete at the base of it all. But, he has obviously had a tremendous last 6 months plus. 2 500 titles in Hamburg and Tokyo last year that were as impressive as they come. I think he's still in a great place, should continue progressing. And then also, Novak squared off with Nishesh Basaverdi. It is great to see my fellow Indian Midwesterner, tearing it up to start 2025. It was a great couple weeks for him, scoring some big wins in Adelaide to make the final there. And then for 2 sets, he really took it to his idol in Novak Djokovic. He was right there with him. And yeah, those couple of weeks to open this season, it showed me some real punch from the back of the court that I didn't know that Nishesh had. I loved the craftiness in his game otherwise, and all of these guys, they made a splash during the Australian Open, and I am excited to see more. And carrying on with that, a lot of these young standouts to start 2025 also being American, your Tien, Mickelson, Basaverdi, and the other guys have started strong as well. Ben Shelton starting the year with a run to the Australian Open semifinal, and even with a draw that opened up for him, I thought he looked really good. Definitely, a clear emphasis on getting better as a returner. The funny thing is, throughout this Australian Open, I actually thought, he could have served a lot better. He said that himself, that he felt like making it to the semis, he'd had like one good service match. And yeah, he was breaking with so much greater frequency than it felt like he has to this point in his career during the Australian Open. And it really was from his first match, a match against Nakashima that I thought was going to be really tough. Then, he got broken the first game of the match, I think, and then did not seed serve the rest of the way. In every single set, once we got to the back end, he was the one applying pressure on return. And, in the rallies in general, just seemed a whole lot more buttoned up, watertight, where he wasn't the one that was making the mistakes in drawn out rallies. There were still the dumb misses once in a while, but as a whole, I thought he looked a whole lot more patient. Even in that semifinal, where I don't think anybody thought he really had a prayer to win the match, he, pretty easily could have, arguably should have won that first set twice up a break, serving for it at 6-5. But a lot to like early doors out of Ben Shelton. Tommy Paul as well, finally got that monkey off his back of making his top 10 debut, and he's won ugly a lot early on in 2025, but he's still stacking up wins, and ultimately he played a terrific match against Zverev in the quarterfinals. And yeah, he put forth the tennis really for the first time in 2025 that, has him pretty dead set as a top 10 hardcourter when he's at his best. Much like, his match with Sinner at the US Open last year, there were multiple sets that you could argue could have gone Tommy's way. But, that has been a struggle with Paul, has been, him as a closer. I've seen him relinquish, some pretty commanding leads on multiple occasions, even since he's established himself as a top player. But I think with those last couple matches at the Australian Open, he showed, he's poised to get back on the wagon and be a real threat on the remainder of this hardcourt stretch. After I thought, after the Olympics, there was a bit of burnout for Tommy last year, the Sinner match at the US Open aside. It did feel like he slowed down following that Olympics in what was an otherwise terrific year for him last year. And now he looks poised to pick up where he left off. And lastly, let's finish on an upbeat note. Shoutouts for, some prime performers early on this year. I want to give a shout out to Felix. He's another one of, the OG Next Gen who, is sort of do or die year. And, aside from a frustrating, I'm sure for him, Australian Open loss from 2-sets to love up, so far so good for Felix Auger-Aliassime. 2 titles, his first one coming outdoors as well in Adelaide. Quality wins, and just watching him, everything except for the backhand, which has continued to be leaky as ever, but everything else, just looks so much more stable than it has the last couple of years. It looks a lot more healthy, the athlete that used to be the selling point of him early on as a prospect, and yeah, it's back intact. He's moving so much better. The big strengths, forehand serve, firing away. Consistency is always going to be up in the air, but at least the strengths are looking like, reliable, bankable strengths again. So shout out Felix Auger-Aliassime. I'd also like to shine the light on Holger Rune. Nothing that really jumps off the page, win-loss, titles, any of that. And he is coming off, a poor loss at Davis Cup to Hamid Medvedev. But even then, he went on to rectify that for Denmark, beating Kecmanovic soon after for Denmark. And yeah, while, similarly in some of his Aussie Open matches where you've seen the same lack of clarity on how he wants to play, there were also glimpses of, the best of him, and it does seem like he's carried some of the momentum he built up to end last year into this season. That innate clutchness has gone nowhere, in spite of maybe making things harder than they needed to be against Xi Jinping. He did play a truly quality match against Matteo Berrettini to earn that win in the second round. And yeah, again, clutch as ever from 4-1 down, 2-1 down against Kecmanovic in the third round. As is often the case, back to the wall, that is when Holger will play his best tennis. Was able to roar back in that one, and yeah, you look at this Aussie Open as a whole, he had Jannik Sinner in his biggest spot of bother. Obviously, maybe conditions, Jannik's illness had something to do with that, but to that I would say Holger himself was not fresh as a daisy in that match, and it really was in the balance there early in the third set. I think Holger had, 3 looks early on in Jannik's first or second service game, and they played probably the point of the match, that long, drawn-out, extended rally that was, maybe the point of the tournament, and Jannik ended up coming out on top and seemed to give him a second win from there. But yeah, Holger Rune looking much closer to the best version of himself, at least on occasion, to start this year. And then lastly, shout out Gael Monfils. Can't leave out the ageless wonder, and Monfils' start to this season has been something. He was the one who took out the title in Adelaide. He obviously took out 4-seed Taylor Fritz. Before that, took out Pechi Pericard in the first round. And yeah, his longevity has been something to behold. I remember I thought that Monf got super unfortunate at the timing of the pandemic, because really, he's been playing a whole lot more disciplined since like 2019-ish. I remember he won Rotterdam that year, made quarters at the French and the US Open. Then the following year, this is where I thought he got really unlucky, because I think he won Montpellier, won Rotterdam, and was the closest he ever was to beating Djokovic, the match where he had those match points in Dubai. And at that time, he was playing some of his best tennis. I thought he was super unlucky. The tour shut down soon after, and his momentum was sort of shot to bits. The next time he had some traction, 2022, lost in 5 of another Slam quarterfinal at the Oz. If you remember, beat Daniil Medvedev at Indian Wells. And then that summer, it looked like he might have torn his Achilles. I remember watching the injury, And truth be told, at that point, I thought it was over for him. Turned out to be a foot issue, but again, momentum was shot, and he looked pretty cooked for a lot of 2023 when he came back. He had that epic comeback against Baez in Paris at Roland Garros, late night epic finish there. And after that, it just seemed to get better and better. He snuck in a title at the end of 2023 in Stockholm. Last year, obviously, the highlight being a win over Carlos Alcaraz. And this year, again, he started, just sublimely. And it is crazy to see because, it's him and Novak at this point, obviously to varying degrees, but those are your remnants. Wawrinka's there as well. But these are your two doing, something of note on a half-consistent basis as, the relics of the past era. And I don't think anybody could have anticipated Monf, of all people, to be still standing. 38 years of age and all, and what's also remarkable is how much better he's become in finals. He's gone from one of the most notoriously poor finals performers to a reasonably good bet to show up on Sundays. Been super efficient in this twilight phase of his career, actually converting his finals into titles. And you love to see it. But that does it for my post-Australian Open takeaways, things I'm going to have an eye on over the next month or so. If you made it this far, thank you so much for watching. I hope that you enjoyed, and if you did, it would be much appreciated if you could drop a like, help this video perform a lot better in YouTube's algorithm, and also subscribe if you're not already. Thank you all again so much for watching, and of course, I will see you all in the next one.